Good evening and welcome to the members of the Community Stakeholder Forum and welcome to the wider viewing audience at home. I'd like to do a quick introduction, as I do at the start of each meeting, for anybody who hasn't been to these webinars before. This forum is part of an innovative approach adopted by Uttlesford District Council to engage the whole community in conversations about shaping the future of the district through its local plan. At the heart of this approach is an open public consultation taking place over several months rather than the usual weeks. The plan itself has been broken down into smaller topics which can be more easily debated and commented upon. Every couple of weeks, this forum meets for a presentation on a particular topic. This forum is made up of people who represent different interest areas across the region, but it cannot represent every interest area or every group of residents. The forum debate that follows each presentation is designed to stimulate the public consultation, and it is important to note that it's the public consultation that is the most important element of this process. It is really vital that all stakeholders contribute to the debate. Can I urge everyone to use their networks of contacts to share the forum presentations and encourage participation and comment, especially try to involve members of the community who may not otherwise make their voices heard. If you go to the UDC website and search the new local plan, you will find various buttons that allow you to submit your views under each topic. At the end of this consultation period, Uttlesford District Council will consider all the representations received during this time and consider them when drafting the local plan. So to be clear, this group is independent of the council, is not a decision-making body, and its members' views will not override those contributed by the wider community throughout the public consultation. Participants have been asked to make contributions from the perspective of their special interest area, rather than to advance any personal or professional agenda, such as in relation to their place of residence or the interests of a specific organisation. Now, turning to this evening's meeting, which is about homes. If you are watching and you're not on the panel, can I encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function? We have disabled the chat function for people not on the forum, but you can submit questions on the Q&A, and please do so. We only have time for about 3 or 4 public questions at the end of the debate. So if you see something relating to your question there, please upvote it, because it will be the most popular 3 or 4 that we choose in the end. So I'd now like to welcome Jo Mills, who is the co-author of the Uttlesford Housing Study. And Jo is going to give us a presentation this evening on homes. Thanks very much, Jo.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuting myself, but I think I have now. So hopefully you can all hear me. And my next technical challenge will be to share my screen, but that should work as well. As that, yes, does that, can everybody see that okay? Then I'll move to this there we go. That's lovely. Good. So I'm delighted to be with you tonight, and to be talking to you all about. I've called my talk "Providing Homes to Meet Local Needs." I work with ARC Housing Consultancy, and we were commissioned in 2019 to produce a housing study for Uttlesford and Braintree. And at that point, there was a draft local plan that included a number of new communities. So it was particularly looking at that, but also looked more widely. And we submitted our final report in June last year. Some of you may have attended one of our 2 listening events in October 2019, which was with councillors and a number of people representing local organisations. And it was councillors from Essex County Council, Uttlesford and Braintree district councils. And the key messages that we heard from people were about the need to meet the needs of local people, and the cost of housing and how difficult it was for people wanting to stay in the area, or young people to be able to live in Uttlesford. And also the challenges for quite a lot of people who work in Uttlesford, and that might be teachers or people working in the health service, people working in care services, or at the airport, or and its surrounds, but just the challenge, the sort of issues about people already living in Uttlesford and those who work in Uttlesford. And then there was quite a lot of conversation in both sessions about the relationship between housing, employment, community, a sense of community, the environment, and the quality of life. And really that they are all, interrelated, and we need to think of them together, or the parts they each contribute to the whole. So firstly, just to sort of think a little bit about Uttlesford. Uttlesford's a large rural district with market towns and villages. There's a lot of people are employed within local communities, in schools, health and social care, all the kind of shops and other local services, and small and medium-sized employers. And then there are two big employment and employer areas. One of those is the biotech, Chesterford Research Park, and other aspects in the north of the district, and then employment around Stansted, either in the airport itself, or obviously it's a bit different over the last year, but broadly in the airport and the businesses around the airport. Like most of the country, Uttlesford has an ageing population, so important to think about the housing needs of older people, and also to think about the needs of young people and the struggle they may have to be able to stay in the district or live in the district because of cost. And housing in Uttlesford is expensive. It's a beautiful area, and housing is expensive. The average income in Uttlesford is above the national average. But even so, when we compare it to housing costs, 60% of residents of Uttlesford earn less than £34,000 a year, and 40% of residents earn below £25,000 a year. And in order to buy a typical two-bedroomed new build home in Uttlesford costing around £325,000, it needs a household income of £50,000, plus the deposit that you'd need to be able to get a mortgage. And in order to buy a two-bedroom shared ownership home, also you'd need to find a deposit, but smaller one, and a household income of £30,000. So you can think about if there are then young people or young families, and the cost of childcare and nurseries, or if one parent isn't working full time. You can just see the number of people in the district for whom there will be the ability to be able to kind of buy a house or have access to rented accommodation is quite a challenge. So that means there is a significant need for affordable housing, and that's across affordable and social rented and shared ownership. And the council's policies, and I'm sure in the proposed policies which they will see emerging in the new local plan, will be a requirement for a significant level of affordable housing, and that is at the moment 40% affordable, and it will cover a range of shared ownership and affordable and social rented. From the study, we were also strongly recommending that the council, and I'd say, clearly it's not the council that builds most of the houses, although it might build some, but the council and then developers and house builders, there are real opportunities to enhance the range and supply of other intermediate housing. And by that, it's something that sits between affordable and full market, outright sale with market housing. So there are options in there like rent to buy. So you can be renting, and then if you're, say, somebody where you'd expect your income to increase as you get promotions, then if you're on a rent to buy product, some of your rent will go to help you save for a deposit. So that challenge of finding whatever it is, the £30,000 to be able to buy a house, these products will enable you to rent and then either buy that property or take a deposit amount of money and buy somewhere. So when people don't have access to the bank of mum and dad, these kind of options are really helpful to explore the whole range of intermediate housing. And also we're recommending strengthening the market rented offer through encouraging institutional investors who are doing a build to rent. So they're a house or flat type that is designed really to be rented. So it might be family housing with smaller gardens than usual, because people might not want to look after a garden in the same way as if you're living long term somewhere. And that might be targeted at young people or people who haven't, are able to afford rental, maybe don't want to buy at the moment. And there's some uncertainty then about what the future demand is, but there's a lot of thought that if there was a good private rented offer, then the demand for that would increase. And at the moment, we know a lot of people working at the airport rent in Bishop Stortford. So there's opportunity, we think, to look at increasing some of that, strengthening some of that provision in Nuttallsford. It also means, and we strongly recommend the council, but also all the partners, to have a real commitment to quality. That's about house design. We're very aware, we're all in this meeting from our own homes. So we've become very aware in this last year about the need to have space and flexible space so that we and our children can work and study from home. So space standards are really important, not just the design from outside, but also space standards. And then partly linked to climate change, partly, but also with benefits in terms of fuel poverty, the real importance of building to high energy efficiency so that properties are really well insulated and have got low carbon heating and energy use. And then, as I was saying, important to think about how the outdoor space is designed so that it helps to encourage in a new development that strengthening of community. This is a picture from Marmalade Lane, which is a co-housing scheme in Cambridge. And you can see how some of that design then encourages people to gather and meet in the street, where there's kind of informal seating areas and smaller private gardens. So those things, just things to think about, maybe a bit different from what we're used to. We also strongly recommend some sort of serious engagement by developers and the council in terms of talking to local people about what do they want. So as part of our study, we didn't do that local consultation, but there will be opportunities for that through the local plan and through as housing schemes are developed, to really listen to what do people want, because then it's very helpful for people bringing forward proposals to have that ability to tap into what local people want. So, but our view is really good to encourage major house builders to provide a variety of different designs and layout and to have some variety there. To think about what are the opportunities for local builders. It's often difficult to get access to land, but again, that helps to give choice to people looking to buy. Opportunities to develop custom and self-build. There's a self-build register in the council, as in all councils, with quite a number of people interested in that. And again, perhaps a role for the council or another agency to help that help those people to find land and to then kind of project manage that development. And again, there was some partnerships potential there with local builders. And then also options around community-led housing and co-housing, things like community-led, community land trusts. There are 3 themes in the study, which are choice, which you'll feel is linking back to what I've been saying about innovation and variety in tenure, a proactive housing options and advice service so that people living in Nuttallsford can really see that range of housing options available to everyone, reviewing the council's allocations policy and making really good use of local lettings plans. The second theme is around engagement and collaboration. And again, a bit as I've said about really engaging and working with communities and residents about what new housing they would like to see to keep communities sustainable, working with employers, so understanding the housing needs of their employees, and also working very much in partnership with promoters and applicants of major developments and housing associations. And that was the feedback we got from the major developers that we spoke to. they would really like to understand the council's priorities and to work closely with the council as they develop their proposals. The third theme is around the importance then of delivery. So it's not just a plan that sits somewhere, but actually what role can the council play in accelerating construction through the way it manages and determines planning applications, and also directly in providing a new and expanded council house programme and facilitating custom and community-led housing. And there were some clear examples and recommendations in the study, which I think has probably been published by the council, but Sarah, I'm sure, can tell us when I get to the end. And then in all of this, there's the question of the role of stakeholders and what contribution can residents, communities, developers, employers, and all of you make to the delivery of new homes. So to sum up, we are recommending it's really important to prioritise affordable housing, rented housing and shared ownership, to strengthen intermediate and private rented offers, to encourage diversity so that both gives people choice, but also will mean that through uncertain economic times, delivery is more likely to continue, and that will mean that the housing programmes are quite resilient through any ups and downs of the economy, to engage and inspire local people, to work collaboratively with major promoters, developers and local builders, and to be ambitious. So you might not always achieve everything you want, but aim for a lot. And then all areas that successfully deliver housing programmes and major housing developments have effective and good civic leadership. So there's a strong role there for local politicians to be able to, kind of provide that leadership in bringing forward housing schemes. And I'll stop sharing so that we can take questions, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Jo. That was really interesting presentation. And now I think what we'll do is we'll go around the stakeholder forum and take comments and questions from anybody who would like to contribute. Just another note to remind people at home that if you want to post questions, please do so on the Q&A. Please check that your question isn't already there, as it was better to upvote your question. It's more likely to get asked because we ask the most popular ones. We actually have a guest member on the stakeholder forum today, which is Alastair Pollock. And so I'm going to come to Alastair first and see if there's anything he would like to comment on or add to Jo's presentation. Alastair.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to this very important forum. So I'm Alastair Pollock. I'm Strategy Housing Coordinator across Essex. It's my role. I work with various partnerships, two partnerships specifically. And I think, following on from Jo's very useful presentation, I would say that I think the key question that we all need to ask ourselves is, what type of housing, ideally we'd like to live in that needs to be built going forward out of the plan. And I would say that this could typically cover kind of four areas. So, we might want to look at the tenure, we might want to look at the size, and then the type and the design. So breaking that down into a little bit more detail in terms of tenure, that's very much about the mix between affordable and market housing. And typically the mix in a typical plan will be 40% affordable, 60% market housing. And then in terms of that affordable element, you again would have a further split down into what would you want as social rent, which would be typically around 30%, and what you might want as discounted market housing. So those are sort of areas that evidence will support where you go with that. In terms of size, Jo mentioned sort of the aspirations of the Parker Morris standards. They are the standards that are kind of considered to be generous, and those are the ones that certainly I personally like to aspire to. In terms of type of housing, well, we're talking about whether you want to live in a service block, which has a number of advantages. you could have just central heating, communal heating systems and such things as that. Or you could have, more traditional terrace property, semis and detached properties. So again, that's sort of something to think about. And finally, in terms of design, I think one of the most important areas is around, appearance and also sustainability, as mentioned. So I think important thing is, in terms of zero carbon, low carbon, are we prepared to pay, let's say, a premium for that type of housing product? In terms of modern methods of construction, a big drive going on by government to increase the numbers of houses built by modern methods of construction. Again, is there going to be a premium on that? Are we happy to pay for that? And I just say finally, importance of health and well-being, and that is something that's sort of enveloping everything now in terms of how master plans put together and how houses are individually built out on plots and how they fit into the wider environment in terms of where you can carry out assessments to assess how much open space there is, for example, to contribute to health and well-being. And there's some very good tools around. Essex has a tool called Live Well, which helps to sort of evaluate the health and well-being of a scheme, and then gives accreditation as well going forward for the developer. So that's my summary of the housing position and the housing sort of choices that you might like to make. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alastair. Thank you for that. Would anybody like to go first to contribute? Alison, I just want to check if you want to say anything, because I know that you can't stay with us all evening. Would you like to comment on this subject? You don't have to.
Well, I don't not want to comment because it's important, but I can't disagree with any of the things that Alastair just said. And yeah, I don't think I've got anything extra to bring to the table at the moment. Thanks.
That's absolutely fine. Anybody else? Anthony?
Yes, thanks. Housing's always been a difficulty, hasn't it? I remember back in the latter 60s when I was fresh out of university and putting forth my own ideas in what was a socialist state at the time. My concept was people pods, and I'll develop this further when it comes to my putting in response. But quite simply, the situation is that you build 2-bedroom houses, which is fine, but on the other hand, children come along, get in the way of 2-bedroom houses. Now, the simple answer to that is to have a bolt-on extra. And this can be done with modern building techniques, I've no doubt whatsoever. It doesn't have to belong to the owner come renter, or as the case may be. It is an extra for the sake of the children, and it assists the parties develop their family. In due course, of course, they'll move on, in which case, if they haven't have an interest in the property, then in those circumstances, they have an interest in the 2-bedroom property because the other part of it is taken away. It's a very simple idea. It just means that people don't have to worry about having to develop a family in what can only be considered to be barrack room conditions.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Samantha?
Yes, hello. So I agree with the presentations and comments on old people and providing for them, and also for young people. Old people have needs for decent housing and not just care homes. So I'd really like to see that made a priority, since we are with an ageing population. And of course, young people can't afford because they're usually at the bottom of their career ladder and aren't earning that much. But also there's the issue of homelessness. So increasingly we have people on low incomes. With the current situation with the coronavirus and people, companies going on bust, and with people being made redundant or put on lower incomes or different contracts, people do tend to be, I've heard, losing their homes. So there's a homelessness problem too. And from what I hear, there's an issue with converted office blocks, particularly in the Harlow area. And this may be where people from Uttlesford end up because there isn't the adequate housing supply for people to be housed. So that's what I've heard, that if you're homeless, you might not be housed locally. You might be housed in these converted office blocks, which are really actually quite substandard because they weren't built to the normal building standards. So they have very little space and very little outside space and garden space. So that's a real issue. So I think we need to think about how we treat people from our area who are homeless, because that could be increasingly affecting people within the next few years. How do we deal with that, and what are the standards? Because from what I'm reading about the situation with the converted office blocks is that they are severely bad for mental health. There have been suicides, there have been drug dealings and all sorts of bad things going on there. So what do we do about this sort of problem of homelessness? And it's financed by the rental payments from Universal Credit. So the landlords of these substandard buildings rake in a big income from the inflated prices they charge on Universal Credit for accommodation that is truly substandard and not worth the money. So how can we give decent accommodation to these young families? And they may even be domestic violence victims going there. I don't really know what is happening to people who are in those situations. And these are, during the coronavirus pandemic, situations that women might find themselves in, particularly increasingly needing to leave and wanting to keep local connections as well. So if you're being sent further afield, that's impossible. And likewise for families and children who are uprooted from school, if you suddenly leave, you lose your job and you have to leave. So how do we deal with that? And can we deal with it on a local level? Or can we help people to stay local when they have those sorts of issues? And are there better ways of housing than putting people in converted office blocks? And I hope that's not what is happening to people. But I've heard that Harlow is the destination for some people. Thank you.
Joe, do you want to say anything about the issues that Samantha has raised, or indeed Anthony's innovative 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom house option?
I'm happy to have it. So I think on the homelessness, I'm not going to, that was largely outside the scope of our study. But as you might know, Samantha, all councils are required to have a homelessness strategy. So, and within that homelessness strategy, it is to look at, how do you meet the needs of homelessness people, and how do you really focus on homelessness prevention? But I know that there might be somebody else in the council that wants to pick up more on that. But I know that from talking to Judith, the housing strategy, the housing manager for Uttlesford, fairly recently, you're absolutely right that the number of homeless people and the demand for, the number of people on the housing register for the council has gone up over the last year or so compared to the situation before. But it's a bit out of my scope. I share some of your concerns about converted office blocks. I would imagine that's not a major issue within Uttlesford itself, but there is then the challenge about making sure that there is an adequate supply of affordable housing and affordable rented housing coming forward for people who've been in insecure housing and now need some help to find somewhere to live. I thought, and then on the topic of the 2-bedroom with an add-on, I was only using the 2-bedroom as a sort of affordability example. Clearly, if you then have a family and you want a 3-bedroom and you're on a average income, it's very difficult in Uttlesford. So again, yet another reason really for making sure that there's some really good thought about intermediate housing options and affordable housing delivery in Uttlesford. I think it's probably technologically or technically possible to add on an extra kind of unit, but whether it's as simple as it sounds, given kind of land take and what space, when you're designing, a housing development, what does that mean about kind of having a 2-bed, and who pays for that extra unit when it gets bolted on, and how does that work? So I imagine there might be some complications in delivering it, but I'm sure it's technically possible.
Thanks very much, Joe. Frank.
Yes, please. I wanted to pick up quickly on what Samantha was saying about the Harlow office blocks. I don't dispute it. I am a school governor in Harlow, and I'm well aware that the town centre office blocks are typically used by inner London authorities putting out their homeless and putting out their difficult to house people because it's cheaper and it's very convenient for them because it's not on their patch anymore. So the Harlow schools have to pick up
people who, children who may well be resident for a very short time until they hopefully find something better. So that's one point. The other thing I was going to say about the affordable homes percentage, this 40% of each estate. Well, the catch is that it only applies if you build more than 14 houses on an estate. And I'm afraid the developer trick in our area is only build small estates with 13 houses, so you don't have to have the affordables. It's a good trick, really, isn't it? So that's sad. And why not just reduce that threshold down to 5 or 10 houses, perhaps, and you have to then provide the affordables. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank. Edward?
Hello, thank you. I'd like to wave the environmental flag, if I may. It's really important that we reduce the carbon footprint of construction. An average 2-bedroom house has 80 tons of embodied CO2, and that's enough for 5 family cars or 24 flights to Hong Kong. So it is seriously unsustainable. And instead, we should be using housing as a carbon sink. And you can easily do that, firstly, by going back to wood. And if you use cross-laminated timber, which is now called CLT, you can build up to 18 stories high, 280 feet high, which is higher than anything we'll need in Uttlesford. And you can build bridges out of it as well. So let's get back to wood. That will support a forestry industry. And it can always be used when you demolish the house, you reuse the wood just as they used to do in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. There are other exciting materials. There's loads of new alternatives to concrete, green concretes that involve hemp or ashcrete, ferroc, and even use recycled plastic. We must avoid bricks because they have a huge high carbon cost in their manufacture and transport. And there is green steel. We can make green steel from recycled scrap, which we currently export, and reform the steel using electric arc furnaces. And by having a policy to do that in Uttlesford, we can expect developers, we must expect developers to apply these technologies that will stimulate these new sustainable industries. We've got huge leverage if we put it into our plan. We need to reduce the carbon footprint of the operation of the house just by better insulation. Energy efficiency will make the homes cheaper to run and they will end fuel poverty. And that is so important. We get heat exchange of water and ventilation. Those technologies will get cheaper if every house has to have them. That will take away the premium of this and it'll just be a standard thing on every house. Make them mandatory and they will become massively cheaper. We need to stop supplying gas to new developments. Gas is on the way out. Solar panels supplied as standard and mandatory on all commercial builds. And then exploit ground source heat pumps. If you're building a playing field or a green space, get ground source heat pumps into that and support community ground source heat pumps, especially in rural contexts where people are dependent on oil, which is frequently stolen. Then they can get community projects for shared energy from ground source heat pumps. The best thing about affordability, I mean, firstly, a greenhouse is going to be a cheaper house at the end of the day. We must stop talking about premiums because a premium simply means if you avoid your premium now, you're going to have to face a huge cost of retrofitting in a few years' time. So let's get that out of our vocabulary. Most exciting, if you go for modular homes, so those are homes manufactured in local factories. There's one in Peterborough, for example. Those start at just £80,000 for a 2-bedroom house. Now, that is the factory cost as it comes out, but it's fully equipped with a fully equipped kitchen and bathroom and central heating and electronics. It doesn't include the cost of the land or the groundworks, but suddenly you've got really affordable homes that are built in just 3 days on site. And I think that opens up huge prospects for council housing and the private rented sector and any of those mixes of renting that you were talking about. So yeah, that's me done from the environmental point of view. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Edward. Jo, do you want to comment on anything that Edward or Frank mentioned there?
I think that's absolutely right about, you know, the issues in terms of London boroughs, but probably less relevant for Uttlesford than Harlow. But I mean, clearly huge challenges for those boroughs in terms of their housing needs and access to land. I fully support everything you're saying on the environment. I think that having some clear messages on the environment and what's encouraged is really important, and it comes into me about that choice and diversity, about you know, some modular housing can offer some advantages in terms of price, but also it is about the insulation, because it's produced in the factory and comes as a unit, which then looks quite bespoke when it's out on site. Actually, it has some pretty strong environmental standards, and I agree, if we get a little bit used to paying a bit more for the house, and then the running costs will be less. And so I think coming that into the place in terms of how everyone can work together to get some of those messages out, it's changing. So it's not, you know, it's you might be able to afford a bigger mortgage if the running costs are less, or, you know, be able to, you know, it's just where those choices go. And then how you make some housing options cheaper, which make them more affordable for those for whom, you know, they can afford something, but actually making it a bit less. And that's where some of the often co-housing and custom build options have a very strong commitment to environmental quality as well.
Thanks very much. Samantha, I've noted you've got your hand up, but I'll just give people who haven't spoken yet a chance. And actually, thank you, Rich. I see you've got your hand up. I just wondered if Alastair wanted to come back on anything he'd heard so far, and then I'll come to you, Richard.
The only thing about looking at housing for vulnerable people, I think going back to Samantha's first point she was making, is that authorities will be doing fairly detailed assessments of their housing needs. So, and that is, you know, it is trying to make it into a bit of a science where you can actually pinpoint down into absolute numbers in terms of what housing is required for this type of group, that type of group, particularly kind of for older people, younger people, and come up with some figures that will then help guide the housing sector, you know, development sector, in terms of building out the houses that meet the needs. So that, again, is something that you would hope would reflect in the local plans. Thank you.
Thanks, Alastair. So everyone's moved around on my screen. So I've lost you. Richard was next, and then Colin, I'll come to you after that, if that's okay. Sorry, I think I missed your hand up there, Colin. I'll do Richard, then Colin. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just a couple of comments on things that have arisen so far. Just with regard to Frank's point about the threshold at which affordable housing is required, I mean, yes, I agree with him entirely. I mean, by all means, the threshold should be lowered. Unfortunately, central government has a lot to say about that. And I mean, there was actually a judicial review case on it. And I think West Berkshire, it was, actually won their case, but then the government overturned it. So there is a threshold, I can't remember what it is now, whether it's 10 units, but there is a threshold below which local authorities cannot go. And in fact, in the planning white paper, the government was actually proposing, albeit on a temporary basis, to put the threshold up to 40 or 50 units, which would have been a complete nonsense for a place like Uttlesford. But what happens in the final analysis, I don't know. But that is a problem created by central government. Just with regard to Edward's points, yes, these are all very well, but I think you have got to think of aesthetics. And I mean, system-built housing is not pretty, and we live in a very beautiful area. So I think we have to think in terms of the design of these things, as well as their carbon footprint. Then just a couple of questions for Joe. I mean, have you seen, Joe, an increase in interest of community land trusts? I mean, are they coming forward in a big way?
Do you want to answer that, Joe?
I think in the study we reference, so East Cambridgeshire District Council just took a very strong kind of view really on wanting to work with community land trusts. And so that's taken a little time. But actually, I think they've got a company as well called Palace Green Homes, and a lot of their villages have now got community land trusts coming forward and delivering local homes for local people, which then actually are based around often are based around affordable housing. So some of those questions about a developer being required to do the 40%, that stronger community endeavour, and that can be led through parish and town councils or groups working closely with parish and town councils. And the council can play a part in helping to support and facilitate that. And then there's the government is still supporting advisors across the country to help develop community land trusts. So I think there's quite a lot of interest in different parts of the country in different community-led housing options, and I think that is something where I would have thought there might be quite a significant interest within Uttlesford, and it does help to get around some of that threshold level for affordable.
Yes, I mean, there's one just been set up in Thaxted, and the reason it's been set up is because it's to exercise that degree of control as to who has the nomination rights. Because one of the problems was that if you get affordable housing in your village, there's no guarantee it's going to go to local villages. So that's always been a problem, whereas the land trust, community land trust, will actually overcome that. There is just one further point though on that. In the draft local plan that was aborted, there was a proposal with regard to exception sites that if you had an exception site, you could pay for the affordable housing by making it up with market housing, which struck me and a lot of other people as a complete nonsense, because these were sites which were not deemed suitable for development. And so therefore to put in your affordable housing on them, but also make it up with perhaps could be sort of 60% private housing, just seemed like a bit of a nonsense. And I just wonder whether any of the planners present might like to comment on that.
Would they?
Perhaps not.
Only to say that, I mean, we're starting again with a new local plan. We'll be looking at the policies in the withdrawn local plan to see if it's appropriate that any of them are continued, but where we think it's not appropriate, then we won't be continuing them, and that will be up to the decisions of members as we go through the process.
Good, thank you.
And a reminder that all subjects of numbers of houses and where houses should be built are in fact the subject of the next forum discussion. So we're focusing today on the kinds of houses that we want built. And with that, I shall move over to Colin. Oh, you're on mute, Colin.
Sorry about that. You picked up on the point that I was going to make, is that we're actually discussing in some depth the ecology and the technology that's going to be applied to new houses, and the adaptability of the houses. But in actual fact, that's all national issues. It's not something that's covered in a local plan or even a neighbourhood plan. And so whilst the conversation is very, very interesting, I can't see what contribution it's making. The real issue is the one that you said is going into the next meeting, is really the issue of what are we going to build and where are we going to build, and what is actually going to influence the houses that we build. The thing is, at the moment, the developers are discussing with the planners, and I think the developers pick up a lot of the bad press, but they have to agree with the planners before they proceed on anything. And they're actually expanding the existing settlements. Not always the way that we would like to see it, but the fact is it's been agreed with the planners before they do it. And what I thought we were going to do here is help the planners to understand what it is we as a general population would like to see going forward. Do we think that we should go forward by expanding our existing developments, or do we revert to the last local plan or a modification of it where it's new developments in new areas, or do we perhaps take a third look at it and say, okay, we've got all sorts of mixed development, like currents in a bun through all of the settlements, and should we be looking at developing premises nearer to the centre of towns for people who have limited mobility, like the older people? Should there be settlements in the middle of the towns for the very young people? And should the developments that are for the people that live in the area but have no intention of working in the area and going to travel out, should they be in locations that are adjacent to
I'm going to stop you there because I have been told quite clearly that this session is not about the thing that the questions you're posing, which are of course all good ones. Those ones are very much for the next discussion, and that this one is about the types of houses, the proportion of the number of houses that need to be built will be fixed at some point by somebody. And within that, there will be some say as to the proportion of affordable housing, as I understand it, the proportion of build to rent, and the various categories that Joe has been discussing. And so that's what the planners want to hear from us about today. But there will certainly be the opportunity next week to get into the nitty-gritty of where and the questions that you've just raised.
That's fine. That's fine. Reversing then to the points that we're being asked to discuss. We don't have a sill, so we are affected by this threshold for the number of developments, and that is something which really I think the council and the planners could work towards addressing, in which case then all of the new developments are contributing towards the infrastructure development. The thing with ecology, I think the thoughts that are being put forward are very, very good. But the fact is, I don't know that our planners have much influence over that. That isn't that national planning guidance that controls that.
Joe, do you
Yeah, shall I just make so Stephen may want to say things too, but I was in a former life, I was Director of Planning at South Cambridgeshire District Council, your neighbour. And my view was always, and actually it's always there, was that, yes, you're absolutely right that there are, there's a national planning policy framework and there are building regulations and things which are nationally set. There's then a local plan policy, but all of those are frameworks and policy. And if I can think of some examples from not particularly thinking of South Cambridgeshire or Uttlesford, but I can think of examples where people have actually had some really innovative ideas. And if they don't fit neatly in kind of like the planning policy route, it might be that nobody wants to make it difficult, but actually it is incredibly difficult for them to bring it forward. So, and then they either get very exhausted or they might just, kind of lose heart and go elsewhere. And that's about an attitude of mind. And that's why I was talking about that attitude of mind, really, because it seems to me it's about if somebody comes in, and I saw one of the questions asked about what if something's slightly out of the box. And so I think fitting in with some of the comments and questions in the box around, and I think you were saying, not certain about, or somebody was saying not certain about modular housing because we really care about how things look, we care about the design and the environment. Some of that is around encouraging some innovation and some new ideas, and that's not going, well, the policy requires this. It's actually having the ability to engage very actively with people with some bright ideas at an early stage, and help them to shape those ideas perhaps in a way that then will be acceptable in planning terms and enable people in Uttlesford to go, actually that's really exciting to see something different, something different there. So I'm a very strong advocate of of the way as local plans written and the way the planning department and the housing department, you know, and councillors approach things, is that kind of how can we help? You know, the Planning Act has always been around. Development should come forward as long as it's sustainable. So it should be around how do we make sure we get good quality development that encourages high standards and some creativity and helps people who want to do something different rather than unintentionally making it very difficult for them.
Helpful, Colin?
Sorry?
Is that helpful, and did you want to make any other points?
No, I mean, Joe has picked up very well the points I'm making. I think what we're doing is we're descending a little bit into the detail of ecology, rather than discussing how we're going to apply that in and how it's going to be reflected in the local plan.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I go back to Samantha, did anybody else want to make a contribution? Anthony, you want to make a second one? Anyone that hasn't spoken? No? Okay, I'm going over to Samantha and then I'll come back to Anthony. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you. Yes, just on the homelessness point, yeah, I agree. It may be lots of people from London who may be homeless coming in to the Harlow accommodation that's converted office blocks. But I've also heard that it's people in the southeast and the south, and as well as London. So last year they were writing to 70 boroughs to tell them not to actually transfer people from the southeast as well into the accommodation because it is substandard. And currently they have people there who are disabled people, and also just homeless families, people with pushchairs as well, so people with young families, and that's the sort of accommodation it's providing. So it sounds really disturbing to me, and I think that it's not just a short-term thing. It tends to be that people get to be there for quite a while, and maybe that's during COVID. I'll look into it further, but it sounds to me like they're there on a longer term basis than just until something else comes up. So it doesn't sound very nice from a mental health point of view, given that I've told you about what else goes on in those places, that accommodation, because it is converted without due regard for planning process. It's allowed, it's without planning permission essentially, that they're allowed to convert those buildings. So I know it's not quite the Ottlesford situation, but people from our district may well be ending up going there, and that concerns me a lot, as well as the humanitarian aspects of people from anywhere going there, which is just terrible. And also the reason why people might go there is because if you consider the fact that a two-bedroom flat in our district in Saffron Walden, for instance, may cost upwards of £1,500 per month, you can see why that people may be sent to other areas because it is cheaper than living here. So that could be a factor of why it's cheaper, but nonetheless, it's expensive for the square footage, the space that you get, which is not very big. It's still expensive, and it's not worth doing that to people. So yes, that was the point I wanted to come back on. And I do have some other points to raise if you want to hear some new points as well, which is I wondered about I heard it was a while back about a scheme in Holland where old people, so elderly people, lived in the community with younger people, and the younger people provided a basic sort of socializing and nice activities in return for a slightly reduced rent. And it seemed to be like a happy way of accommodating people within the community, so that everyone gets something out of that, and you still get like to have meaningful contact with your community. And I wondered if that kind of idea might be looked into and considered. I can't remember where I saw it, but I definitely saw something like that was happening. And I was also interested as well to note on the diagrams for the documentation that was sent round that more space is needed for gypsies and travellers to have their pitches. Obviously they have needs and they have a lifestyle that needs to be considered as well, and they're severely discriminated against generally. And also they have particular problems with education, so accessing a stable and meaningful education for children who are born into that lifestyle and end up living without having access to presumably adequate facilities to do homework or whatever. So all that also needs to be considered. What can we do for people who don't have the traditional lifestyle that we have? And I've seen that we have problems in Saffron Walden with unofficial pitches being put up, and nobody likes that. Obviously we don't. It causes mess and distress for everyone, and it's a conflict between the community of travellers and the people who live in houses, and that's an understandable conflict, and it needs to be addressed somehow by having planned sites, and I have no idea where that would be, but it needs to be looked at. So I'm glad people are considering it. Thanks
very much, Samantha. Anthony, do you want to make some?
I first came across modular housing in Canada, in New Brunswick, in 2003, and it was a lovely laid out estate. An old school friend of mine lived in it, and I had no idea that it was modular housing whatsoever until he told me. And I need to say, perhaps like Richard, I was somewhat concerned about whether or not it would fall down and all the rest of it. No problem with it at all. So since then, I've come across exactly the same in New Zealand and also in Australia. I don't think there's anything wrong with modular housing.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Joe, would you like to come back on any of those points? Modular housing, traveller sites?
I think what I would, if people are interested, there are some demonstrator opportunities to go and look at, what people are doing in terms of new modular housing, and there are housing estates where there are a few amongst the rest, and it's not that easy to tell them apart really. So I wouldn't rule it out. I think it's worth exploring for the council. I was going to come back on the housing for older people and mixed ages, was just to say, again, I think if we think of what creates a new community and a sustainable community, actually people of all ages have a strong contribution to play to that, and a strong part to play. So somebody earlier, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, but was talking about, making sure that old people's housing is quite near to shops and facilities. And then actually, if you're at the heart of the community, there's opportunities which can be, kind of thought about quite easily in terms of opportunities to mix within communities. So I agree, there are some interesting models in Holland, but I think there's also some quite interesting developments here. And the NHS and MHCLG had a Healthy New Town programme, and in South Cambridgeshire, Northstowe is one of those. Many of those are then thinking about how you design in, and I know that's not our topic for today, but but how the way in which you design the houses and the footpaths and the sort of way you move around a development. If it's safe for older people and it's quite easy to orientate yourself if you're a bit forgetful, then it'll also work just as well for children. So and then those natural opportunities arise, don't they, whereby people can talk like we do in our villages between different ages. So I think the more we can kind of try and think of how we plan new communities so that they take the best of our existing communities and and enable those to come forward. That's good to think about.
Great, thank you very much, Joe. Did anybody else have any other comments they wanted to make before we move on to public questions?
I've got one sort of addition to add, which is we're all sitting around watching, looking at these screens tonight. That's typical of the way we're going to go forward. So it's about embracing technology and the digital world we're in. So it's very much about, from a planning perspective, making sure that first of all we've got the infrastructure in place in Uttlesford and elsewhere in Essex to deliver fast, broadband essentially. And there's lots of surveys and maps that will show you where the areas are that are deficient. And I think there is money going in to try and resolve some of those areas, pockets of deficiency. But also then, moving on into the home, where you can actually look at the home and make sure that that is functioning in the most efficient way, and it touches on some of the things that Edward certainly was talking about in terms of modern methods of building and being energy efficient. So I think that's quite kind of important area to look at for planners as we go forward.
Thanks very much, Alastair. Samantha?
Yes, I thought just to add, don't know if it's mentioned yet, but to have extra communal facilities. So when we build new houses, we have existing village halls, but we don't necessarily have enough communal facilities for people to meet on a regular basis to engage in activities. So while we're building the houses, we need to think about those shared spaces as well that we really need in order to socialise for well-being. Thank you.
Thanks for that point. Frank?
Yes, thanks. Alastair was just mentioning connectivity, digital connectivity in rural areas in particular. In my area, I heard this week that GigaClear, who've been doing most of the cabling, have decided a couple of streets are now not worth doing. They've pulled out, which is rather concerning because they were the only people doing the work anyway.
That does sound a bit upsetting for those two streets. Goodness me. Anybody else before we move on to public questions on this topic? No? Okay, then I am coming to Sarah, I think, to ask if you would like to put some of the public questions.
Yes, thank you. So the top ones come from Michael Fairchild, who asks, to what extent is UDC's housing policy based on government targets or local needs? If the latter, what research has UDC conducted to establish to what extent the need is genuinely affordable homes for young people in Uttlesford, market price homes for people who already live in Uttlesford, and those from outside? He calls it the escape to the countryside factor. I don't know whether Stephen and then I don't know, Joe can answer that.
Yes, I'm happy to help answer that. I mean, the answer is kind of both of them, in that the government tells us how to, it gives us the definition of local housing need in the National Planning Policy Framework, and it tells us that the local housing need is calculated using the standard methodology set out in National Planning Practice, which when we last calculated it for Uttlesford was just over 700 dwellings per year. That's calculated based on projecting forward past growth and then increasing that where housing is unaffordable, as it currently is in Uttlesford. But we'll be talking more about that next time in 2 weeks' time.
Okay, move on. So one from Simon Short. I don't know whether Alastair might have some views on this. What is the process by which UDC could direct a developer to think outside the box in terms of house design, so we don't just get a pick and mix standard housing development across the district? More imaginative housing design is one part of making an area more attractive, as is ensuring energy efficiency, low carbon energy, etc. So Alastair or Stephen again.
Well, I'll just start off and Stephen can probably carry on. But I mean, the local authorities have had in the past have had their own design guides, although the government have kind of really pushed back on that, said no, there's going to be one national design guide, and we don't want local authorities getting involved in design. That's my understanding. But I think there still is ways and means of influencing design because it is quite important and critical, and that's what often makes gets planning committees certainly going when they start debating design, and so yeah, I think it's sort of having some sort of design code. We're going to have design codes in developments or master plans. So I'm sure Colin is works on all the time. I think this design code principle in Cambridge has been very successful in some of the new schemes there, where you can actually get really high quality developments, and you can have different qualities from site to site because design code will vary from one plot to another. So they all complement each other, but they are slightly different. And that works through MMC as well, with the work Swan do. They use wood and they have like a palette of, 1,000 or 10,000 different options in terms of how you design your house. But ultimately it all comes together to hopefully all look nice from a street perspective. Thanks.
I just add, because I completely agree with that, but I think there's also a very good track record, isn't there, and background in Essex with in terms of the urban design team that are available across, kind of working in Essex, and certainly in Cambridge and and South Cambridgeshire, where there were the design guides for particular developments. There were also urban designers who would very much engage alongside the planners in having those conversations about really raising the quality and having a very active dialogue with the developers around the look of the houses. Bringing that design code to life, which I think is critical really for high quality development.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I've got the Essex Design Guide, which I'm not sure whether Uttlesford have sort of adopted it or what their approach is to it, but I mean, most authorities have sort of generally sort of said yes, they want to work within the Essex Design Guide, and that is constantly changing, updating new chapters, and is quite a very useful tool to help in the end of the day generate good quality design.
Moving on. So we have a question next from Margaret Shaw about bungalows and downsizing, enabling people to downsize. So Uttlesford currently asks for 5% of new builds to be bungalows. This is totally inadequate, especially as 40% of that 5% has to be in the rental sector. Until there are appropriate bungalows, 3-bed bungalows with garage for older people to downsize to, there will be no opportunity to free up underused family homes. What plans are there to increase the number of high quality, older person friendly bungalows in all new developments? I don't know who wants to answer that. I'm not sure we have an answer, Stephen.
No, we don't have an answer yet, because the local plan will be evidence-led. So we will be looking at getting evidence in place to look at what the needs are for bungalows and other types of housing. It's useful to hear that people think that there is a need for more bungalows, but we need to look at the evidence alongside people's views, and we will be using both of those to inform the draft of the local plan. So no answer yet, but we will have one.
How are we doing for time, Angela?
We're fine for one more question if there's one you want to ask, Sarah.
Okay. If I do one question, and then actually there was a comment from somebody who obviously works in the affordable housing sector that I might read out if that's okay. But Richard Gilead asks about can design standards include temperature control and water management, which again I think is probably coming in a lot under building regs. I don't know if Alastair's got some knowledge on that.
Not really. I saw Colin was nodding. I'm not a building control expert, but my guess that it is, but I have to qualify that with someone who knows a bit more.
Colin, do you have knowledge on this?
No.
You have no knowledge, Sarah.
Okay.
Well, the only I might be able to help here. The only knowledge I have is in the withdrawn local plan. There was a policy seeking to limit the average number of litres of water used per person per day in new housing, and that was going, I think, below building regulations. I'd have to reread the policy to remember it properly, but we certainly had some kind of policy looking at limiting the amount of water per person per day in new homes. So that's something I would hope can look at again.
So finally, if I can, Angela, there's quite an interesting comment from Graham Mann, which picks up on some of the debate we've had earlier. He says, quite agree that a large percentage of market housing on rural exception sites is a nonsense. However, as a rural specialist housing association, we often rely on a small number of open market or discounted homes for cross-subsidy of the affordable rented homes at grant levels, as grant levels are minimal. The NPPF encourages local planning authorities to consider a small number of market homes for this purpose, perhaps 2 or 3 homes that may be suitable for downsizing older people. It would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to provide truly affordable homes for local people in rural areas without this subsidy. So just somebody coming from that aspect.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks everybody for the questions and the answers. So I'm moving on to what happens next with this theme. The consultation document will now be published on the website for open public debate. Comments received by the 7th of April will be summarised by officers and discussed at a future meeting of the forum. Comments received after this date will be taken into account by officers when preparing the draft local plan. So you've got lots of time to submit comments, but if you want them discussed again by this forum, please do so by the 7th of April. Then it just leaves me on this particular theme to thank Joe and Alastair for their contributions today. We're going to be moving on and back to a previous theme, which is leisure, culture and healthy lifestyles. If you'd like to stay with us, please do. But if you want to leave us, thank you very much again for joining us this evening. Thank you. So,
thank you very much. I will exit, but wish you well with the rest of the meeting and look forward to following the plan as it develops. And by all means, Stephen, if you want to come back with any more discussion about housing, come to me. I'm based at Castle Point Borough Council. I think you have Angela and Joe have my email address. So yeah, have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alastair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So we're going back now to the responses received from theme 5, which is leisure, culture and healthy lifestyles. And I believe I'm handing over to Lois, who is going to introduce the summary document. Over to you, Lois. Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to read out some of the comments that we've had. And as you recall, we were trying to cover 3 themes in that topic. And so we've had quite a range of comments from about 25 respondees altogether. The comments are on the website, and there is a nice sort of summary diagram which Joanna did, which really just summarises the comments. But the first questions we were asking were around how could open space be made more accessible or improved? So that was all around about accessibility and connectivity. So we've had a host of comments on this, and one around how we expand and link up with the existing open space network. So that's just trying to make the linkages between the footpaths and the open spaces that we already have, as well as creating new ones. And quite important to create a traffic-free off-road network, obviously, as well, because that's safer as well than just relying on footpaths alongside the roads. Then there's several comments on how to, well, the need to improve the Flitch Way, that it's not fully connected, of course, it doesn't necessarily connect with other places as easily as perhaps it should, and that it might be a possibility to convert some of the buildings along that route for sort of community uses, and that would encourage more use of the route itself, or the recreation route itself. But obviously all this comes down to funding and money as well. Just a general comments about prioritising walking, and of course that we should be doing that. And complaints really about the state of some of the pavements that are either too narrow or the traffic alongside them is too fast, and the need to maintain footpaths, of course, as well. And that perhaps we should have, in every village, we could have designated walks, so that would be designated walking routes. So that's quite a nice idea, which would obviously encourage people to walk around, which actually relates to our healthy lifestyle theme a little bit later on as well. More on curating equestrian greenways as well as cycling and walking, and how to encourage cycling as well, to make sure that there isn't a conflict with horse riders or with walkers, but that there are safe off-road routes for cyclists and equestrian users as well. There's a range of comments on to making sure that access into the countryside and along the routes is actually clearer than perhaps it is at the moment. So better signposting and making it clear what land we can access and what land that we can't access. I think we did have that discussion about going into some of our country homes and so on, where you are allowed to roam or where you're not allowed to roam. So I think people are asking for that to be a little bit clearer than perhaps they feel it is at the moment. And then part of that really is making sure that our open spaces, so this isn't just the routes, this is the open spaces, that are absolutely protected. Obviously they provide recreational areas in themselves, but they really don't want them to be built on, and they're really asking the local plan to make sure that some of these spaces are properly protected and will not become development areas. And that might include creating new nature reserves as well, and encouraging more biodiversity on our existing open spaces, and also making sure that developers, if their development is adjoining an open space, you know, they actually provide funds to help enhance it, or make sure they do provide amenity space within their own developments. That would include seating and connected routes and so on. In terms of connecting open spaces, there's quite a lot of comments about making sure that Hatfield Forest, of course, is protected. Yeah, I think that's more or less it on the leisure and accessibility side. There's a little bit now on buildings and open spaces and how we can create a sense of, or how we should be creating a sense of community and help to prevent social isolation. So that was sort of taking planning into sort of more mental health and healthy living aspects. There's a host of comments on making sure that we had a range and a mix of facilities, because obviously that would encourage more people to come to there and to join in, socialise and so on. Obviously they have to be well maintained, and again make sure that we protect and maintain the green spaces as well as the community buildings as well. There are a few comments on making sure there's sufficient land to grow sort of communal growing of orchards or food and allotments and so on. And again, that's seen not in itself, obviously it's a good thing, but also as a way for people, another reason for people to come together, work together and have that sense of community. There are a plea really, I suppose you could say, for a new country park, and that relates back to the need for open space and protected open space. So there are quite a few comments here saying that could we do a really good restoration of Easton Park. Quite a lot of comments on that actually, but just generally having a nice big open space in the district. There's a comment on 15-minute neighbourhood, which we've touched on in several of our sessions, the idea which we have also acknowledged is more difficult in some of the village areas, to make sure that all facilities, or the majority of facilities, are within about a 15-minute walk from your own house, and the sort of concentric rings of facilities that are easily accessible. And some comments about how we actually address health inequalities and just inequality generally through the planning process. The last section on the sort of leisure bit is around about what kind of facilities. So we've talked about access and protecting. This is actually the facilities themselves. And not so many comments on this, interestingly. So there's a general comment that we should have activities which are appropriate to demographics of the population. We've just heard in this presentation this evening about an ageing population. So this is picking up on that, and also people with young children as well, just making sure there's a range of facilities. It's not all just a sort of the active sort of 30-year-olds. So, you know, making sure that we actually can provide places, not just sport, but recreation and activity places for everybody. Teenagers feature here. Again, we've covered that in some of our forum as well, that how we provide a wide range of activities suitable for teenagers. And it's not just sport again, so it's sort of meeting places and informal meeting places as well for them. However, having said all that, there's also some other comments that we are short of sports facilities anyway, just general sports facilities. So, you know, that's something we will need to take account of, especially when we talk about population growth as well. And the little comment around Stansted, feeling their facilities there are particularly inadequate. So that's all the comments on that first section. I don't know whether there are any questions on that.
Would anybody like to comment on that first section? We're going to do it in sections. So, Samantha?
Yes, I noted the comments on equestrianism and about it being the second most popular part of the local economy. And I remembered last week's presentation, which said that actually agriculture was not really very much of the local economy in terms of percentage, although it took a lot of area of the local of the district. So I wondered if that could be checked, because I don't know whether that's it just struck me that agriculture wasn't a big factor. and it's comparing equestrianism with agriculture and saying it's the second most important. And yet, as far as I can remember, agriculture wasn't important in monetary terms. So that needs checking, presumably. I noted the comment on sports for women and girls. Again, this comment was made in relation to the equestrianism. And I think we do need to, not just in relation to horse riding, but in relation to generally for women and girls, have our youth facilities, are they adequately focused on the needs of women and girls? So for instance, there isn't diversity in football for women. So I've been reading recently that there isn't, and maybe there isn't enough priority, but I don't really know whether there is or not, but it's something that certainly needs to be looked at, whether our recreation facilities are adequately attracting women and girls because of the obesity and well-being and exercise issues involved, as well as exercise classes on green space, I think was also mentioned. I tend to agree the cost of exercise classes is really high. It's between £8 and £10 per session, and not everyone can afford that in our area. Just given what we've said today about incomes, not everyone can prioritise spending money on their recreation. So I do think it's important that we have some low-cost classes, whether these are outdoors or indoors. It's actually important to actually prioritise probably at least some low cost, or making them low cost for those who are in need. I don't know which one would be appropriate, but we certainly need to do something probably. So for instance, universal credit claimants won't be paying £10 per hour for their boot camp class or whatever. They won't be able to do that, I don't think. And also making health and well-being a priority is absolutely, I agree, that's the important thing that we should have, the emphasis being on our well-being rather than making profit for developers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samantha. Stuart?
Oh, thank you, yes. There's the Hatfield Forest being under unsustainable pressure is a recurring theme, and it's going to be coming up, and it has been for some years now. Eastern Park is an absolutely ideal solution to relieve the pressure on Hatfield Forest. But the problem with that is that we're not quite sure what the future of Eastern Park is going to be. There is an agreement dated 1939 to preserve it as an open space and a nature sanctuary. The problem with that agreement is that we don't know whether the councillors, the members of the council, intend to respect that agreement or not. And I've been trying to raise that with the council, the officers, and we're waiting to see what happens. We're hoping to put a motion to the council, full council, in the next month or two. After that, we can work out whether Eastern Park could be the solution to Hatfield Forest problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Lois, back to you.
Okay, our next section was on culture. And this was looking at the first sort of series of questions, was looking at the range of arts and cultural facilities in the district, and absolute praise for Saffron Screen and Saffron Hall, wonderful places, but they felt there was an under provision elsewhere. And although people are saying a surprising number of museums, they felt there's a lack of more sort of theatre sort of provision and proper, theatre provision and, stage provision as well. So, that's something that perhaps we could look at, although also it's quite difficult because of the catchment area. There's an interesting comment about there needs to be a properly coordinated tourist information service for the district as a whole. Well, that's quite an interesting comment as well. We did have a speaker here, didn't we, from the Tourist Information Office. Some comments around the cultural facilities in Stansted, saying there were 50 voluntary organisations and there's quite a bit to do around there. And some comments on what's available in Thaxted as well. Now that we then came to a question about, is there a lack of venues for culture and arts and adult education, and what should they be? And that's when the idea of the theatre was picked up, good for concerts, but poorer for theatres, and that we should have perhaps more of an arts centre complex as well, like in Bishop Stortford, and I think there's one similar in Harlow as well. People are asking for more live music venues, but recognise that, again, you'd need quite a large catchment, and more than that, you need really good transport to be able to make that work, and performance space as well. That's a similar sort of thing. Okay, now it's talking about, because, and this was picked up when we had a talk on rural communities, because there's a range of, we've got lots of rural, small isolated rural communities, and they can't possibly have the full range of social facilities, then the need for transport, sustainable transport, reliable transport, transport that goes where you want it to go and when you want it to go, is absolutely critical. And we know this is very difficult to achieve in our area as well, but it's certainly a big issue that we do need to address. And there's a comment that developers shouldn't be allowed to renege on the promise, or it's normally enshrined in a section or a planning agreement, on their promise to create and to build community facilities. And it's asking what the council we can do to improve that. But we should, we can do planning agreements, and certainly they would be required to build community facilities if that's in the agreement. So I think we could probably address that one. That's all we've got on culture.
Thank you. Would anybody like to comment on that? Janet?
Just wanted to comment on the tourism. It's funded by Saffron Walden Town Council. It's not across all of Uttlesford, although they do provide a lot that's beyond their remit. And I think that should, if we could solve that, we could definitely cover the area better. And the other comment I wanted to make was that adult education is an Essex service, and because of their funding regime, it's quite limited as to what they can do. And some of the centres that they have, especially the one in Saffron Walden, isn't used that much.
Thanks very much, Janet. Samantha?
Yes, thank you. I was at a community listening event yesterday, which was hosted by Uttlesford District Council as well. And at that event, it was said that Uttlesford is 95.4% white. So I want to raise this as a diversity comment, which is that we do have ethnic minority, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in our area. So I wondered if, as a matter of culture and being welcoming, we should have an audit of the history of Saffron Walden, including the Quaker history, because they were heavily involved in the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. And then we could look with pride on our local history, which relates to the rest of Britain, and our district's equality efforts. And we could also focus on education for all to learn about the people from the different empire countries, the Commonwealth countries, and have an opportunity to learn. So have the website linking to articles of history taught in an honest and open way, and also good resources that we could use, possibly in conjunction with the library, just having reading lists, and which could also inform the school's curriculum and maybe link into that kind of thing. And we could also focus on that as a tourism thing, because the Quakers were quite famous for championing the abolition of the slave trade and for working with the slave people who did come over to tour Britain at the time. So that could be something we could do, which would be create a welcoming and universal atmosphere here that would just let everyone know that they are included, even if they are different and not the majority of the people here. We could also have multicultural festival, diversity type festival events. Also, we do have music venues, such as a local pub that's in Newport, the Coach and Horses, which has a garden that's used as a music venue. And I hope that that can continue if the planning permission doesn't get granted. Currently they are under another planning application. And I also noticed what was said about using pubs, and that was in this document as well, as community hubs. And again, the Coach and Horses is actually used for that purpose, for mothers and toddlers, and to have family events, because it's has such a large safe garden, free from cars, and just where you can watch your children. So it's a really nice place. So it's the same thing, it's a wellbeing facility, and if we can use those facilities, that would be brilliant. And if we can keep those facilities, that is what we need to do. Thank you.
Thanks. John.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly second the comment about multicultural festival type things. I mean, multiculturalism seems to be, yesterday's idea in some circles, but my own experience in Cumbria, where we were in danger of being very monocultural, was that increased the importance and the significance and even the success of the Multicultural Community Forum that was established. And all that we've been talking about, and I've said this previously, we have this balance, I assume, between meeting the needs of the people who are already here, but asking who is it that is coming in? Who do we want to come in? I believe we want to build a diverse and rich culture going forward, and that may require some community capacity building at this point. But so I just wanted to briefly second that comment.
Thank you, John. I don't normally comment myself because I'm the chair, but as this is kind of my topic, I hope I could be indulged for 2 minutes to just say that I completely agree on the importance of culture. Of course, I would. I'm picking up on Samantha and John's point. Multiculturalism and the richness of our culture is so important. And I would just leave you with this thought that in ancient Greece, it was compulsory for citizens to attend the theatre. And the reason for that was that to explore ideas of politics and human relationships and all the big thoughts of the day, it was only really adequately done for all sections of the population through theatre. It's so important for our understanding of each other, for different cultures, for our feelings, our emotions, our understandings, and our well-being. And that many local authorities now, even in these very difficult times, have put culture at the centre of every single aspect of their local plans and their policies. And I will be very happy to direct Uttlesford to a few of the areas that have done that and the success they've had, particularly in the area of multiculturalism, but in all areas. Sorry, I will step back into the role of the chair. Lois, have you?
Oh, and that's very interesting. We would like to talk to you later. Thank you. The last bit does overlap very much with what you've said, actually, because it's about healthy lifestyles. And of course, we're talking about mental and sort of cultural health and wealth as much as physical as well. But the first issue we wanted to explore was how can we enable people to take more physical exercise and eat more healthily and nurture mental well-being as well. Now, one of the sort of bunch of comments was around having more places to meet, and people talk about community centres and day centres, and actually also pubs as well, and how we can try and keep pubs open and sort of informal meeting places like that. It's so important for sort of incidental contact, as well as the more formal places like the theatres that you're talking about. And there's a comment here on the churches. I know we've just been talking about multiculturalism, but this is a comment about churches specifically and church halls that perhaps could be redesigned as flexible spaces for use every day of the week and for, community activities. I know that probably does happen anyway, but they're asking, can we do more of that and look for grants to try and make them become more energy efficient and more usable as well. Around the healthy sort of living is more provision for active travel. I think that's been picked up quite a lot earlier when we were talking about better footpaths, equestrian routes, cycling and so on. Lots of comments here about having a recreational network, safe routes, well signposted and so on, country path routes. So we know that, and we'll definitely be able to pick up on that in our sustainable transport work. And also people are saying, could we have public spaces that are usable all year round? I mean, obviously in the wintertime it tends to be a bit, less accessible, but they're asking for paths and places that you can actually go, with wheelchair or pushchair, and it's more accessible all year round as well. The comments around putting health and well-being, which is an interesting comment which is being picked up more and more these days, having health and well-being actually at the heart of planning decisions and the planning process, so that you're considering air quality, access to open space, the design of houses, things to do, all these things we've been talking about, all come around to creating a healthy, wealthy and happy place. And really, this is something that these comments say it should be at the heart of what we do. So you don't have sort of monochrome, mono-varied housing estates with nothing to do, but we're trying to seek that richness in whether it's in cultural diversity or or activities or environment, then we've got to really think about the sort of communities that we're creating. And another comment again, to make sure that when facilities are on the map on a developer's proposals, they are actually delivered and promised and delivered as promised as well. So again, that's something we can definitely pick up through our planning work, through our planning policy work. There's some comments about allowing more markets and food festivals and allotments, and just therefore helping to encourage healthy eating and a healthy lifestyle. And quite a few comments which are around poverty and people not having the sort of comments that Samantha was talking about, really, people not being able to afford to do formal activities. So having more breakfast clubs, milk at break times, having support groups and so on, which can actually help people, you know, maintain their mental health. Because the TCP, the Town and County Planning Association presentation that we had did pick up very much on health and poor diet and poor quality homes and that interrelationship and how we should be planning for healthy places. And that's very much one of the tenets of the TCPA anyway, but Julia did very much emphasise that. And then a final few comments on how we design for mental well-being, and we're talking about having a housing mix, having gardens, having places, incidental places to meet, good living conditions, having facilities for local interest groups and community groups to meet. So you've got that sort of incidental socialisation as well as more formal ones. And then some comments about the range of facilities in Stansted, more on sort of recreation facilities that we need. There should be more open space, little provision for team sports and so on, but very specific comments around that. And that is it.
Thank you very much, Lois. Any further comments on that topic? Richard?
I mean, just as a general point, considering there are only 25 respondees to that, there was some really good stuff, I thought, in that. And I mean, it was a very, very good summary, and it was very comprehensive. A lot of good ideas. How much of it is going to be able to be translated into planning policy is debatable, but there were some very good ideas, and I think, you know, the 25 people who responded to be congratulated. Just a point there on community buildings. I mean, every village pretty much has got a village hall, but a lot of them are pretty depressing. And I just wonder whether there could be a bit of an initiative for a refurbishment program of village halls. And the alternative to that is the use of churches, which is something which we've touched on before. But I mean, the church is usually not only the finest building in most villages, but it's also one of the biggest, and it does provide a very good meeting space, which is hugely underused. And so I would just, whatever we can do to encourage a greater use of churches, I think it would be a very good way forward. And just to answer Angela's point about compulsory attendance at theatres, well, unfortunately, we couldn't do that in Uttlesford because we haven't got one. And I mean, this is, I think, a priority. And if anyone would like to look further at the United Reformed Church in Thaxted, I'm sure the elders there would be delighted to talk to them. It's a wonderful building, would make a wonderful theatre and a wonderful opera venue. So just a final thought.
The only comment I would make about all cultural venues is that, and I don't say this pointedly about Saffron Hall, it applies everywhere, is that any cultural venue is actually quite easy to build. The trick is always sustaining the activity within it once you've built it, because all culture is subsidised by somebody somehow. So just there always has to be a plan to sustain it once it's built, which is why the shared facilities are so clever. If you can share a building with somebody else, it massively cuts the cost for both parties. But Frank, sorry, I should not be speaking. Over to you.
Sorry, very, very quickly. I was just picking up the point at the end of the list in Stansted. There are no public toilets. Who's responsible for putting in public toilets? I can't imagine it's normally developers, but they are a critical facility, certainly for, shall we say, people of a certain age who want to use leisure facilities or even just, you know, walk around the park. If you don't have public loos, it makes it very difficult for some people. Any comment?
For that? Does anybody know who's responsible for public toilets? Stephen, Lois?
Well,
I think that sums it up.
I thought it was a district council function. I mean, I'm only getting my own experience, and then I know in my own experience the parish council took it over, took them over. But I don't know who. I don't know whether Stephen, you know.
I don't have any experience in Uttlesford of this, but in a previous life, working for Cambridge City Council, I know it was the City Council which provided new public toilets, although there were various campaigns at various times about public toilets being closed, and the similar points being made as have been made tonight, although there are still multiple public toilets within Cambridge.
Uttlesford has always accepted responsibility for the public toilets in Saffron Walden, so presumably the whole area, if there are any. So it's they who have not provided them, as opposed to provided them, whichever way you want to look at it.
That would match my experience in Cambridge, yes.
Thank you, Frank. It's an important point, and clearly one that needs to be looked at further. Samantha, did you have a very quick one? We're quite out of time, but if you've got a quick point.
Yes, we don't have a public loo either in Newport, and I did notice once when using the village hall that people would pop in and plead to be able to use it, but our village hall isn't always open, so it is a problem, and our railway station doesn't have a public loo either. So it was something that I thought, but when I ask people tell me it's not necessary, but I can't imagine that it's not necessary, because if you want to use public rights of way, which are all over Newport, you'd have to go somewhere, wouldn't you? Otherwise you just have to not drink, and it's a hydration question, so I don't know how people do it.
Major problem anyway being that we have uncovered at the 11th hour. So yes, thank you very much for that, everybody. So the next steps for this theme are that the presentation of the key points will be made to the local planning leadership group, and then Stephen will come back and feed back to this forum at a later date. And now we're moving on to item 6, where Stephen is going to in fact update us, if we can think back this far, to theme 3, which was climate change. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Angela. Yes, so the Council's local plan leadership discussed the representations received so far on climate change on the 3rd of March, that's Wednesday last week. So the same summary which was presented to yourselves back on whatever date it was presented to you guys, and then any comments you made were presented to local plan leadership group. The discussions that members had were around a few different things that they discussed. Well, one point was made about whether the comments being made on climate change were strategic enough, or whether they were being focusing too much on detail. I think the conclusion members made overall was that they were valuable, whether they were being strategic or not, and ultimately it's up to the local plan and members themselves to think strategically, taking into account representations on detail and any bigger scale representations as well. The discussion talked about trying to support the switch away from using the car, and there was a discussion there about the realism of that in the relatively rural area of Uttlesford. And the point was also made about, even if we're moving towards electric cars rather than petrol or diesel cars, then they still need a parking space. So this all needs to be thought about. The discussion also talked about agriculture as a contributor as a carbon dioxide contributor. As one member made the point that agriculture does have an impact on CO2, and that's something that we need to think about. And then there was also a discussion around solar farms, which seems to be coming up quite a lot. And one question was put about how can new solar farms be encouraged to add value to the wider community. And those were the main points, main new points made at local plan leadership group. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So now moving on to item 7, which is the upcoming theme. And I believe this is the last theme on our list, which is creating new places and communities on the 24th of March. So there's a guest speaker who will be from the team behind the award-winning Velo City concept, which is centered on a reimagining of the village for the 21st century, which sounds incredibly interesting. And there'll also be a few guest members to our forum to help this discussion. But I believe this is the discussion, Colin, that you were talking about how we build these homes, where and how many and what kind of houses they're going to be in terms of, what was it you said, currents in a bun, your great analogy. So we will discuss the current bun on the 24th of March in creating new places and communities. Is there any other business before we close this evening? No, thank you so much, everybody, once again, for getting through a huge amount. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the 24th of March.
Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Angela.
Bye.